So we can definitely see that we have taken out that slight pinkiness that was there. We can also adjust the temperature. Again, if we feel like there's a bit too much yellow, if it's a bit too warm, we can cool that down. We can move into minus numbers. Obviously, we can do that by hot scrubbing, clicking and dragging through the temperature control down in the bottom part of the color wheels, or if you have a control surface like I do, then we can use the temperature controls here. They are underneath the primary section, so it matches what we have on our screen, but you might need to use the arrow keys here just to move between lift, gamma, and then gain, and then they're the fourth window that you see after that. So you have adjustment, temperature, and tint. Also, it's worth pointing out, you can also do that on the micro panel. So I have the mini panel here, which has the upper portion where I can do this with the screens. But if I had the micro control surface, I can still achieve these temperature and tint adjustments by simply turning on offset. So there's an offset button in the middle above the gamma wheel. And when offset is enabled, then your lift and gamma controls will control your temperature and your tint. And it still works even on the mini panel, but on the micro panel where you don't have this section, that is the only way for you to adjust temperature and tint from the panel. When offset's on, that changes the lift and gamma to do that, and then the gain becomes an offset master wheel, so the whole image will be offset up and down, which is the equivalent of adjusting the offset master wheel, which is this one here. The grading process usually requires a lot of back and forth tweaking of palette values while monitoring the waveform. Some changes dramatically offset the effects of prior adjustments, as in this example, when increasing the contrast darkened the shadows and prompted additional tweaks afterwards. Iteration is a completely natural part of the grading process. Curves are another major grading tool used to perform primary and secondary adjustments. Whereas the master wheels target the luminance range of an image, the curves affect the image based on its luminance or RGB color channels. The curves controls allow you to manipulate the image with great precision and flexibility. So what we're going to do now is select clip 3. This is a shot of some scales. And we're going to change our workspace so that we can better see this image by essentially closing down the clips timeline here. So the keyboard shortcut for this is Option F, or we can go to our workspace drop-down menu at the top here, and in our viewer mode we can change to the enhanced viewer. So the enhanced viewer, or Option F on a Mac keyboard, that would be Alt F in Windows, and that will enable us to enlarge our viewer. The colors in this image are very flat. You can see that the waveform also shows it's quite a flat image, the majority of it. There's a bit of a spike here, which represents the window behind the scales, but the rest of the image is actually in a very narrow band. And that's because this shot has been recorded log. So when you film log, the highlights and shadows are brought together, so the contrast is compressed so that you stand a better chance of retaining information in shadows and highlights. That does put additional emphasis on us in post, though, to then normalize and to technically balance that image, placing highlights and shadows where they should actually live. So make sure that the custom curves palette is open. If you have a wide enough screen, it'll be the area in the middle here. And in case you haven't used curves before, it's worth pointing out that this area in the lower left-hand corner of the graph, that represents the black point, or the blackest part of the image. And then the opposite corner in the top right represents the white point, or the brightest part of the image. The horizontal axis represents the luminance range of the image itself, while the vertical axis represents the offset of that luminance range. So as I adjust this curve up and down, I'm offsetting its luminance in that portion of the tonal range of the image. By default, the luminance curve, so the Y portion, will be visible for adjusting. If we want to make sure that the adjustment is not affecting the red, green and blue channels and is only affecting the luminance component, we can click on the Y. That ungangs them, turns off the RGB parts and just leaves the Y luminance channel for our adjustments. We're going to drag the lowest control point, the one that represents black. I'm going to drag that across the floor to the right. And as we do so, you should see the lowest parts of the traces start to move down. We're going to stop dragging the control point when the bottom of the trace just starts to touch zero. So now we've placed the darkest parts of the traces just above zero. We can now place our highlights. So we're going to do the opposite now and grab the top right control point. We're going to drag that along the ceiling, if you like, of the curves. Now, because this is a transmissive light source, this is a highlight that exceeds that of, say, bright white paper or a fluffy cloud. This is light actually coming in. It's essentially classed as a super bright area. So that can go right up to the top, just underneath 1023. So we are, again, using the context of the image to place our highlights and our shadows. And already the image is obviously looking much more contrasty, much more three-dimensional, and much punchier. We can also add additional control points in the middle area here to adjust any part of the mid-range, whether that's the lower part, the upper part, or the middle. We're just going to click the lower portion of the white line here to add a control point to the curve in that lower mid-range. And now you'll notice when I click on it, it slightly shifts. I've actually made a slight adjustment. If you don't want to, and you often don't, want to adjust the part of the curve where you click to add the control point, rather than clicking on it directly, you can shift click. And when you shift click, so holding down shift on the keyboard and click, it adds a control point without allowing any adjustment to that control point until you let go and have added it and then go back and adjust it. 9 times out of 10, that's what you want to do. So get used to shift clicking these curve lines to add control points that don't shift in their value. Now that we have that placed, we're going to drag the control point up to raise the lower midtones and brighten the face of the scales. A lot of colorists prefer to use the curves because it gives you complete control over the image, but it's nowhere near as fast as working with these tools, and particularly the contrast and pivot options here. So it does depend on how you like to work. For me personally, I like to adjust my lift and gain and then use the contrast and pivot controls, particularly from the control panel. It enables me to do that very fast. But there are a couple of different ways that you can do it, and if you need absolute flexibility, then the curves are the best place to do that. After adjusting the tonal range and contrast, you should carefully examine the colors and neutralize them in preparation for grading. An unbalanced image will affect the precision of your grade, along with the quality of any keyed elements, and it will stand out in a sequence of unbalanced clips. You can use custom curves to manipulate the 3 color channels in great detail by creating dedicated control points on each segment of the luminance on each color channel. So to help us visualize the changes that we're going to make to the RGB channels, we're actually going to go into our waveform options and go back to turning on our RGB version of the scopes, and we're going to make sure that colorize is turned on so we can very clearly see the different parts of the color channels. When you're trying to balance using the RGB waveform, it's worth noting that when the 3 color channels overlap, they go white on the traces, and that means that they are all equal, and equal red, green and blue channels means either black, grey or white. So as we have an object here that has a white face, that should mean that we see traces that overlap and show white on the traces, showing us that there's not an elevated color channel because they are all equal, because they represent a white or neutral object. We can clearly see, if we actually look at this RGB waveform, that the red channel is elevated. It is higher than the other ones, followed by green and then blue behind. Red and green together make yellow. We can actually see with our own eyes that we have this very slight yellow cast. The problem is with our eyes that the longer we look at this image, the more our brain neutralizes it and balances out that change. But we can see it clearly in the scopes. These traces are showing us that the red channel is too high. So if we're trying to neutralize this clock face, we need to isolate this red channel and start to work with it. So in the custom curves palette, we're going to click the R button. That will activate the red channel only for our curves. And we're going to click the top of the red curve and drag it downwards. So we're bringing the red channel down. Pay attention to your scopes And when you see that your traces all go white in this section, you'll know that you have neutralized and balanced the three color channels in the portion of the image that represents an object that is white. Now, if we create a second point on the red curve to perform the same action in the midtones, we can then drag that until the lower half of the trace appears white as well. You can see that it's not quite the same as the top. So we are going to shift and click to add a control point down here. And we're going to adjust until this section. So what we're trying to achieve is a balance between neutralizing the highlights coming in through the window and then separately neutralizing the color tint down here. It's relatively straightforward to get the red tint corrected, but then as you start, you might find that the blue then starts to dominate. So if we move to the blue channel, so click on the B to isolate the blue channel and click the center of the blue curve. So we're going to shift, click in the center here. We can drag that up until we have a completely neutral. You can see the blue channel coming up. If we go too high, it'll come out at the top. Sometimes you have to go one way then the other and just go too far, and you'll find there's a natural point where that balances out. Let's just tweak the tops again. And if we turn that on and off, you can clearly see now before this very dominant red, and then after we have a much cleaner, less yellowy looking image. If you have a panel, there's a dedicated disable button. So we can just disable and re-enable. Talking of the mini panel, you can also use that to control all of your curves in DaVinci Resolve. If you used your keyboard and mouse in DaVinci Resolve or any other image processing application before, chances are you've already worked with these curves. And while you might have previously used a mouse to control them, the mini panel does place dozens of preset curves at your fingertips. So if we look at the curves button here, you can see it's jumped straight to custom because that's where I am, but I also have access to my hue versus hue, hue versus sat, hue versus loom, loom versus sat, and sat versus sat. If I jump to custom, you can see 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100% labeled along the bottom of the screens, allowing me to adjust those very, very quickly and very precisely. Before you normalize the next clip, let's take a slight detour to understand another function that can be a fundamental part of primary grading and balancing, the log color wheel. It is easier to grasp the difference between the primary wheels and the log controls by observing a graphic example before moving on to image adjustments. Let's use the simple gradient image at the end of the timeline and manipulate its brightness to compare how the two adjustments affect it. So let's go back to our workspace menu, viewer mode and enhanced viewer. That will deactivate the enhanced viewer and enable us to see our clips again. I'm going to click on the last clip, clip 18, which is this gradient. In the standard primaries wheels that we've already been working with, you'll be familiar with the lift, gamma and gain wheels that target the luminance. And there's a wide overlap. So for example, if I drag my gain to the left, you can see both in the waveform, we have our histogram here in the curves, you can see that dropping down, but you can also see it dropping down all the way across here. So it's having the most effect on our whites on the right hand side of the image, but it's having a fall off. So there's a reducing effect, but an effect nonetheless, all the way down to 0. If I reset that, grab my lift, if I go up, you can see the same thing. It's predominantly affecting our blacks, which are over on the left-hand side of the screen, but it's also affecting the curve all the way up to the top, but not the very top. It's almost as if it's pinned here, and then it's making its major changes down here, but there are changes all across here. This curve, this part of the curve, for example, was here. So you can see it's a major effect. It's just a diminishing effect. If I reset that, if I grab my gamma, you can see the bulk of the effect is in the mids, whilst pinning the blacks and the whites. So our black and white points stay where they are, and we're adjusting the spread in the middle of the image. And it's very easy to visualize that when we're doing that with that gradient. Now, if we compare that to the log controls, let's go to our log wheels. You can see there's quite a big difference. If I start off with my highlights, you can see the changes I'm making will not affect beyond that point. So I'm only affecting that top section. Now, what that top section is defined by the low range and high range. So you can see my high range is set to 0.55. 1 would be the max, 0 would be nothing. So this essentially is 55%. So as I'm dropping that down, you can see here's 50% and it's just slightly elevated. So that's 55% is the actual point where that no longer affects it. There is, if you look very carefully, a small overlap that's taking place. There is a slight change just below that, but that's deliberately there so that you don't get any hard clipping between changes that fall within one part but not within another. So there's always going to be a small overlap here, and that's desirable, but you can change where that point happens. So if I bring this down and then adjust my high range, you can see it's now adjusting further down the curve. If I bring it up, I'm only affecting a higher point. So for example, if I only wanted to adjust my upper 10%, so I could set this to 0.9, therefore saying that this highlight is only affecting the high range at 90%, and you can see I'm only adjusting that upper 10%. That can be particularly useful if you have some extreme highlights that you need to bring down without affecting the rest of the image, for example. Now, if I reset that and double click on high range to reset that, we can see the shadows here. Now, if I adjust my shadows this time, you can see the opposite's happening. It's just the bottom part of the curve. And this is defined by the low range, which is preset to 0.333. So in other words, the bottom third of this image, or 33%, is being affected by my shadows. If I reset that, there is no explicit control for what denotes the midtone range other than whatever is in between the low and the high is therefore the mid. So if I adjust this, you can see this very small little section in the middle here, which is the area between 33% and 55%, which is being adjusted by my midtones. If I adjust the midtones and then adjust my low, you'll see that that pulls that down. If I adjust my high, you can see that pulls that up. So I'm widening the midtone section by adjusting the low range and high range. Let's reset all of that. Hopefully that gives you a very nice, clear visual representation of the differences between the zones of influence for the primary wheels and the zones of influence for the log wheels. The log wheels can be extremely useful when you are attempting to change the luminance or chrominance of a narrower image luminance range. The next exercise will demonstrate a practical use of switching between primaries and log wheels. So we're going to click on clip 7 this time. So I'm going to drag my gain control to brighten this area now. At the moment I've got it still in my red, green, blue or RGB waveform. I'm going to go back to my Y just so I can concentrate on the luminance. I'm going to drag my gain up and I'm going to place it so that the sky is just at 896, which is about 90% IRE. And that's because the sun actually isn't in the shot, it's already set. If the sun was there, obviously that would be even brighter in these bright areas, but we have this diffuse kind of reflected light, so we're not placing it right at the top. And that looks certainly much brighter, much nicer looking image overall. But if I go back and turn my RGB waveform monitor back on, let's turn Colorize on, you can actually see that I've clipped the red channel. Now, that's easily done when you are averaging out your luminance values and just showing the Y channel, because it is averaging them. So we've got a very low blue channel, but a very high red channel. And because it's averaging them, it looks like we're safe. But as soon as we go into our RGB mode, and you would also see this information, in fact, if you just went to your parade, you can see the red channel has disappeared off the top, it's clipped. If we drag the gain master wheel, we can decrease the brightness and we can make sure that our red channel is in fact not clipping this time. So if we switch the scopes back to waveform, let's come back in here. With our highlights analysed, we can focus on the tonal range and the balance in the dark foreground elements now. So to increase the overall brightness of the image without clipping its highlights, we're going to drag the gamma master wheel until we've brightened up that middle section. So we're dragging it to the right. We don't want it to be too bright and washed out, but just a little bit. And we're going to raise it till the darkest parts of the image are around about 128, which is around about here. When we bring the gamma up, we end up with a slightly milky grey kind of look to the foreground, and that's because there's actually very little tonality there. We can see it's very compressed. So as we bring that up, it looks a bit grey, and you may feel like, well, let's just grab the lift and bring that down, but there's so little separation that actually all you're doing is then pulling all of those elements down too far. This is where the log wheels can help us, because we can leave the bulk of that midtone range where it is and just target the very darkest parts of the image. We're going to drag the shadow master wheel to the left to lower the black point instead. You'll see as we do that, it maintains a lot of that mid-range that we had before. We can even be more targeted by then lowering the low range a bit further. So as I lower the low range, you'll see that we can have a more subtle impact. Let's bring this down even further. And now what we're able to do is just the very darkest parts of the foreground are down. And you can see that gives us quite a big difference. It's really making the most of what little tonality there is in the foreground by targeting just the darkest parts, just in fact the lowest 20%, bringing them down, and therefore leaving the gamma where we placed it in the gamma master wheels. Now, the next thing we want to do is to slightly pull out this magenta tint that we've got in the foreground. Now that makes sense to be something that's done in the primary wheels again, because it's actually quite a broad adjustment across the vast majority of the darker parts of the image. We don't want to affect the brighter parts too much because we've got this nice rich warm pink sunset, but certainly down in these darker areas we want to remove some of the pinkiness there. So it makes sense to then come back to our primary wheels and to go to our lift control, and we're just going to drag the lift color wheel from the middle away from these pinks that we've got. So if we drag them down, we don't want to go too far, we're going to introduce too much green, but just a little touch, just off. So we've got this sort of purpley color that we've got too much of. We're just dragging in the opposite direction because the complementary color will cancel out that tint. So we're dragging actually towards this kind of limey green color here, just a touch. And you can see, again, we're going from this sort of pinky dark flat image to this nice high contrast image. We're keeping the color in the sky, but we're pulling out some of that pinkiness in the foreground. So as you've just seen in this exercise, you can use primaries and log wheels together very effectively. Log wheels behave like a secondary adjustment to a certain extent, and you can use them to refine the three luminance ranges that you establish with the primaries wheels. Log wheels are particularly effective when working on under or overexposed footage as well. They allow for restorative work in the higher and lower ranges, as well as minor tweaks to the brightness and hue of those ranges without seriously altering the remainder of the image. Together with balancing and matching, log wheels are also powerful tools for creating distinctive creative looks.